The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Canadiens souffrent.
Canadians are suffering. I've never seen Canadians suffer like this in my 18 years in politics. I just traveled across the country. I met so many Canadians. In fact, 93,000 Canadians signed up to attend my events. I listened to their stories. I sit with them, and I don't leave a room before I've had the chance to speak to every single person who wants to meet with me. And I heard some devastating stories. For example, young Canadians, 35-year-olds, who've done everything that was expected of them. They got a diploma, they work hard, but they still live in tiny apartments, 400-square-foot apartments, or even in their parents' basements. And why? Because home prices have doubled since this Prime Minister took office. In fact, our real estate bubble is the second worst in the world. Canadians, the number of Canadians who own their own homes is at its lowest in 30 years. When the Prime Minister took office, it took 32% of an average paycheck to pay monthly costs for an average house. But now it takes half of one's paycheck for a normal family just to pay for their home, to keep their home. Why? Because of price increases, but also because of interest rate hikes, which this government promised wouldn't happen for a long time. The government said, don't you worry, you can get big loans, take out big loans because interest rates are going to be so low for so long. There will be no consequences. Do it.
300 points. 3% dans le langage plus commun. C'est pas juste l'immobilier, Madame la Présidente, c'est la nourriture.
It's not just housing, it's also food. Let me please read the headlines because even the media are starting to note the problem. Rents are so high in Toronto that students are living in homeless shelters. Kids are going hungry, and this is of concern as groceries go up. Food banks in the Greater Toronto region are dealing with this highest number of requests. More than 6 million people experience food insecurity, according to a study by the University of Toronto in 2020. 2021. So people can't pay for their food. A single mother cannot pay for food for her kids. Gas. I met with a young man. He works in Northern Ontario in a mine. And he told me that he was not able to go and see his parents for a final time in Thunder Bay because it costs more than $2 a liter for diesel. So he missed the opportunity to say goodbye to his very own parents. And what is the Prime Minister doing in response? First, he's trying to divide by attacking people because he thinks that if one Canadian is afraid of another Canadian, they will forget that they can't pay their bills. They're keeping vaccine rules in place. All the other countries have dropped these requirements. They're keeping a ArriveCan app in place, and it really doesn't work. He's trying to distract people from the cost of living by dividing people and by creating difficulties and division. Second, his plan is to increase taxes on paychecks, gas, heating, and food. So our official opposition, since I came to power, has asked that the tax increases be canceled so that Canadians can keep more of their paychecks, and to ensure that gas, energy, heating, and other costs are more affordable. In fact, that is the role that we play here in Parliament, to transform pain into hope. Canadians need hope. In fact, the comment I hear the most often from people who come to my events is that they say, thank you for this hope, because for the first time people believe that things can get better, and they will, Mr. Speaker or Madam Speaker. We can change this. We can change this situation. We can improve the situation. First of all, we have to cancel all the tax increases, but we also need to control spending. The inflation that we are seeing today is the result of a costly government. Cost of government increases cost of living. $500 billion in inflationary deficit has increased the cost of what we're buying and the interest that we pay. And inflationary taxes are increasing the cost of our companies and for our workers to provide the goods and services. The more that's spent, the more that it costs. That's just inflation. So we can change that trend. We can reverse that trend by putting in place legislation that limits government spending. This would allow politicians to follow the same economic rules as families have to follow. So when a family spends more on one thing in their budget, that means they spend less elsewhere. If they spend $1, they have to find $1. And the same thing should apply to government. In the United States, during the Clinton years, they put in place this kind of legislation, and this allowed the Americans to balance their budget and to pay back $400 billion in debt, the largest debt pay down in the history of the United States. The instant that law was repealed, they fell back into a deficit. So we have to limit spending by politicians, and politicians should follow the same rules as single mothers and small business owners have to follow. Instead of creating money, we have to create more of what the money buys, produce more affordable food, more energy and natural resources here in Canada, build more houses here in Canada. We need to remove obstacles that the Prime Minister has put in place. Let's start with food. He increased taxes on farmers. This increases the cost of fertilizers and the energy needed to produce food. Now they want to limit the use of fertilizer, which obviously required more lands to produce the same amount of food. So tractors and other equipment will have to go across and work over a larger field and therefore burn more diesel and other types of fuel. And we'll have to import more food here. This will require the use of energy in order to transport this food here to Canada from other countries. Have we not learned during COVID that it's irresponsible to depend on other countries to provide us with essential goods? We need to be able to feed ourselves here in Canada. Our farmers are the best in the world. And we should take away the barriers, remove those obstacles that the government has put in place. Absolutely. We will cancel those taxes on our farmers. We'll eliminate the government's plan to reduce the use of fertilizer, and we will eliminate bureaucracy, which is costing farmers a lot. Second, we will encourage municipalities to get rid of their red tape as well. We have the fewest houses per capita in the G7 if we have the largest amount of land. It's ridiculous. That's why we have the highest housing costs compared to family income in the world. In Vancouver, it's the third worst city for property. Toronto is the sixth. The Conservative government will tie infrastructure dollars for major cities where properties are too expensive to the number of housing units built. This will help to reduce the cost of construction permits, allow us to build more, and we will insist that every time the federal government has a new transit station, that the land around must have houses and apartments in order to densify so that people can live near public transit. And third, we will sell 15% of the 37,000 federal buildings in order to transform them into housing and create millions and millions of places for our young people to live and start their families. Instead of importing energy from abroad, we will remove legislation like C-39 and other laws to allow the production of energy here in Canada. This will create jobs and more affordable energy. This will strengthen Canadians' purchasing power by increasing the strength of our dollar. When the energy sector is strong, this increases the dollar's strength. When the dollar is low, it costs a lot to buy everything that needs to be bought on international markets. By strengthening our dollar, producing our own energy, putting an end to imports of oil and gas from abroad. And where are the environmentalists from the NDP and the Liberal Party when it comes to big demonstrations about importing oil and gas from abroad? We should help Canadians get a paycheck here. We want to give Canadians back the control over their own life in the freest country in the world, to ensure that the dollar retains its value so that Canadians can have the lives they're working so hard to have. We want to be a country that gives compensation for the work done and ensure that every time somebody works hard to add value to our economy, they can keep the money in their own pockets and create more for their families. We want to be a country that encourages, that helps those who work hard, who take risks, those who build our country.
Oh, excuse me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm supposed to say Mr. Speaker, aren't I? Thank goodness I have the former Speaker sitting next to me to keep me in line. But it is good to be back in the House. I'm a little bit rusty, I'm afraid. Madam Speaker, no offense was intended, but it is good to be back in the House. But wouldn't it be nice if our young people could have a home? That's what we should be working towards. But unfortunately, yesterday we learned that the rates of home ownership are at their lowest levels in a generation. House prices have doubled under this Prime Minister. In fact, when his Prime Minister took office, the average family could afford their monthly housing costs with 32% of their paycheck. That has rocketed up to almost 50%. Vancouver is the third most overpriced housing market on planet Earth. Toronto, the sixth. We have the second worst housing bubble on planet Earth. No wonder 9 in 10 young Canadians say that they cannot even dream of affording a house. And now, from housing to food, we see here headlines. Even the media has noticed. Rents are so high in Toronto that students are living in homeless shelters. Child hunger, a major concern in Canada amid skyrocketing food prices. GTA food banks say they're facing the highest demand in their history. Nearly 6 million people in Canada experience food insecurity in 2021, U of T study says. And then there's energy. I met a young man in Northern Ontario who said he could not afford to put the diesel in his car to go and see his dying relatives one last time, hundreds of miles away. in Thunder Bay. I met a working man, an energy worker, ironically, who in St. John's, Newfoundland, who said the rising cost of gas meant that he couldn't afford to replace his boots, so he was taping them up with duct tape. Canadians are suffering. Now, why is this happening? Well, the cost of government is driving up the cost of living. $500 billion of inflationary deficits means more dollars chasing fewer goods, leading to higher prices, bidding up the cost of the goods we buy and the interest we pay. Inflationary taxes drive up the cost of businesses and workers to make our goods. The more Liberals spend, the more things cost. It is just inflation, Madam Speaker, and Canadians are paying the price for it. And what has been his response? Well, his first response was to attack the people that were suffering, to call them horrible and disparaging names, to divide and distract. You see, his strategy is simple. He thinks if you're afraid of your neighbor, you'll forget that you can't pay your bills. And so he keeps in place divisive and unscientific vaccine mandates to shut people out of the truckers out of the ability to transport goods across the border, and soldiers who have served our country bravely and loyally out of their jobs. He does this all to stigmatize and attack so that that single mother who's putting water in her kid's milk might forget, he hopes, how badly she is suffering under his watch because she will be afraid of her fellow citizens. Madam Speaker, it is time to replace fear with freedom. It is time for us to all unite. And his second approach has been ever predictable. He wants to raise taxes with a new tax hike on paychecks that will take effect on January 1st, meaning that Canadians will take home less of what they earn. Small businesses will have to pay a higher cost for every single person they keep on the payroll, forcing many to make the painful choice of laying people off. A few months later, on April 1st, April Fool's Day, the Prime Minister will continue to carry out his plan to triple the carbon tax. He wants to increase gas taxes, home heating taxes, and indirectly food taxes because, of course, food requires energy. So this is going to make things worse, and Conservatives have made the demand. This government must cancel all its tax increases on our workers and our seniors so that their paychecks go further and their energy becomes affordable. You know, we in this House have a duty to transform the hurt into hope, and that is what we will do. Because things can get better. There's nothing wrong with Canada, with our country, that can't be cured by what is right with this country. And we have the answers that will counter this inflation and reinforce the purchasing power of Canadians. One, we call for a cap on taxes so that Canadians pay no more to the government and can keep more for themselves. That we call for the government to cap its own spending. And they can do this by simply following the same rules that everyday families follow. You see, if a family decides it wants to build a porch in their front of their house, they cancel their vacation. Or, better yet, they go out and find a deal on lumber, and they look for a way to keep their vacation costs down so that they can do both, but for the same budget. This is how small businesses function as well, but not government. You see, the great Thomas Sowell said the number one law of economics is scarcity. People always want more than there is to have. And the number one rule of politics is to ignore the number one rule of economics. Because politicians are the only creatures in the universe that don't have to live with scarcity. The birds and the trees, the fish and the seas all must make maximum use of limited resources, but the politician just passes on the cost to someone else in higher inflation, debt, and taxes. Well, a pay-as-you-go law would force politicians to make the same either-or trade-offs that everyday Canadians make in their lives. Here's the principle, very simple. The government brings in a new dollar of spending, they should find a dollar of savings to pay for it. All of the existing spending that is in the budget goes ahead into the future, but when governments step into this House to introduce a new measure, they should accompany it with savings to pay for it. You know, they did this in the United States during the 1990s. And that allowed the American government to balance its budget, pay off $400 billion of debt, have booming job growth, record low unemployment, and a massive increase in prosperity. But as soon as they let the law lapse, they went right back into deficit, proving that politicians need the same legal limits on their spending that families follow every single day. Our families have been pinching their pennies long enough. It's time for government to pinch its pennies too. Instead of just creating more cash, why don't we create more of what cash buys? Yeah. Why don't we grow more food, build more houses, and produce more Canadian resources right here in this country? Yeah. Let's do that instead. Let's start with houses. Like I said, we have the fewest houses per capita of any country in the entire G7. Even though we have the most land to build on. Why? Local government gatekeepers stand in the way. In Vancouver, the cost of government gatekeepers, that's permitting, delays, consultants, taxes, for each unit of housing, $600,000 for one unit of housing. It's about $350,000 in Toronto. This prevents people from owning a home. So, well, what I propose is this. The government should link the number of dollars that big overpriced cities get for infrastructure to the number of houses that actually get built, so that we have an incentive for them to remove the gatekeepers, lower the cost, and increase the speed of building permits so that we can get more houses. Let's require that every federally funded transit station be pre-approved for high-density housing around it, so our young people don't even need to own a car. They can live right next to transit. Let's sell off 15% of the overpriced underutilized and overpriced 37,000 federal buildings so we can convert that into housing. Let's create millions of new homes so that our newcomers, our immigrants, our young people, and our working class people can reestablish the dream of home ownership in this country. And let's put an end to importing overseas oil into this country. Where are the protesters? Where are the Bloc, the NDP, and the Liberal protesters standing in St. John, New Brunswick, to greet all of those big tankers coming from overseas? They say that they're against oil, but they have no problem if that oil comes from foreign dictatorships. 130,000 barrels of overseas oil every single day arriving at our shores and taking our money back to their countries at the same time. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister violates his own sanctions against Putin to send back a turbine so that the Russians can continue to pump gas into Germany so the Germans can fund the Russian war against Ukraine. Incredible. They're against pipelines in Canada, but in favor of maintaining the turbines for Russian pipelines that fund foreign wars. Meanwhile, we have 1,300 trillion cubic feet of natural gas that could be used to free Europe from its dependency on Putin. Meanwhile, bringing back paychecks to this country, we have the ability to produce it cleaner than anywhere else on planet Earth. In fact, the shortest shipping distances to both Asia and Europe from North America are right here in Canada. And you know what else we have in Canada that allows us to liquefy natural gas so it fits on a ship? You know what we have? Cold weather, our most abundant natural resource. That actually lowers the cost of liquefying natural gas by 25%. And with Quebec, Newfoundland, and British Columbia hydro, we can do it emissions-free. So why don't we ship our clean Canadian natural gas to Asia to shut down coal-fired plants there and ship it to Europe to break European dependence on Putin? Let's turn dollars for dictators into paychecks for our people in this country. And let's make work pay again in this country. Let's stop punishing people for the crime of getting up early in the morning and putting in a hard day's work. Do you know that according to a Finance Canada document, a single mother with 3 kids earning $55,000 a year goes out and earns another dollar she loses 80 cents of that dollar to government clawbacks and taxes. So she makes $25 an hour. She takes home $5 of that. No one should work for $5 an hour. That is below minimum wage, and yet our tax and benefit system punishes her for trying to work a little harder so that maybe her kids can go to camp in the summer, maybe they can join the Little League team. We should reward hard work in this country. We should set out to reward our we should set out to reform our benefit and tax systems so that every time someone works harder, takes another shift, earns a bonus, gets up a little earlier, that they keep more of what they earn. My parents raised me to believe that it didn't matter where I came from, it mattered where I was going. It didn't matter who I knew, but what I could do. That is the country I want my kids to inherit. I want this to be a country again where it doesn't matter where you start off. If you work hard, if you take risks, if you study, if you learn, if you build, if you contribute, that you can achieve anything you want in this country. Right now, people don't feel that way, but hope is on the way. We are going to bring change to this country. We're going to put change back in your pocket, and we're going to make this the freest country on earth. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honorable questions and comments is coming. I would ask members to please tone it down so that we can allow for the questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Government House Leader. Oh, point of order. The Honourable Member Kitchener Centre.
Madam Speaker, I just want to note in the speech we just heard, I think the member spoke about putting change in your pocket, and I wonder if that's appropriate in this place.
This becomes a point of debate. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, Government House Leader. Questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I want to start by congratulating the Leader of the Opposition on his recent victory. What we are fully aware of, I think what Canadians are quite aware of, is that during his leadership, his leadership contest, he started off quite a bit by talking about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as a solution for people to invest. Now, I already hear the heckles coming from across the way because they don't want me to bring this up, but I have a sincere question for the Leader of the Opposition. You know, he started to change his position on it and pretty much stopped talking about it right around the time that cryptocurrencies took an absolute dive, and anybody who was investing would have seen their investments absolutely devastated. So a genuine question to the Leader of the Opposition. Has he had an opportunity to reflect on that position, and perhaps has he evolved his position on that, and would he be willing to share that with the House?
The Honourable Official Opposition Host.
The only way for all Canadians to avoid inflation is for this government to stop causing it in the first place. The Canadian dollar is the only national currency. It will always be the only national currency of this country. Unfortunately, this government is devaluing the purchasing power of that currency with $500 billion of inflationary deficits. They have driven inflation to its highest levels in 40 years. They've doubled housing prices, which has reduced the purchasing power of the dollar in terms of real estate by half. And that is what we have to fix. We need to reinforce the power of the Canadian dollar by cancelling the inflationary deficits and inflationary taxes that have caused this inflation crisis in the first place.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Lac-Saint-Jean. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to congratulate the new leader of the Conservative Party for his election to the head of his party. First, I'd like to remind him that the leadership race is now over, and now we're talking about C-31 today. This bill, once again, sees federal government intruding into provincial jurisdiction. There's no word about health transfers, and I'm sitting here for 3 years, and every time I ask a question about the Conservatives about health transfers, the same answer. They say we'll sit down with the Prime Minister and decide after. And the problem is that the Premier of the Quebec and the other provincials have already sat down. They've already put a figure to the health transfer of 35%. And can the new leader of the Conservative Party make a commitment to answer the Quebec's the demand and put a figure to this amount? Because we now need a new answer from the Conservative Party. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition. But the member is right. The Liberals are adding other issues, even when they're not able to manage the current programs. We already have a crisis in the healthcare system that the government is doing nothing to solve. We have a government that cannot protect our borders. There are people who are crossing illegally or arms traffickers, and the government cannot even deliver passports. So why should we trust the government to now be able to manage real estate and dental care? Madam Speaker, a government that cannot take its own responsibilities seriously should not be extending and expanding its list of responsibilities that it's working on.
Questions and comments? Senator Viskina Balkley Valley.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I too share my congratulations with the Conservatives' new leader. I'm a little perplexed, though, because in a 20-minute speech, we didn't hear a single mention of dental care, one of the major components of the legislation we're debating this morning. Now, I've heard from constituents, seniors who can't chew their food, from parents who can't afford to get their kids the basic dental care that they need, and from people who work in dental offices who see every day Canadians who can't afford the procedures that they need. Now, the Conservatives a year ago voted against our motion to create a national dental care plan. I'm wondering, to the Leader of the Official Opposition, does he intend to continue that legacy?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the member is quite right to say that Canadians are suffering under the policies that he is supporting. He is part of this costly coalition.
That's right.
And everything that is happening in Canada is the paradise for which the NDP has been dreaming all of these years. Yes. They are now realizing all of the policies that they always wanted. Basically, we have an NDP prime minister in this country. And what has it given us? 40-year highs in inflation, double the housing prices, record low home ownership rates, people who, like the member said, that can't afford the basics of life. That is the consequence of this costly coalition of bigger government and smaller citizens that are on the, whereby Canadians are carrying this heavy load. So here's the question. Why would we trust this government to create new programs when it can't run the programs it already has? It can't protect our borders. Yes. They can't keep out the guns. They can't stop the crime, even though the criminal code is federal responsibility. They can't even deliver a passport. How can we expect them to run our lives?
Yeah! Then comments, the Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and my congratulations as well to the Leader of the Official Opposition. I understand he's concerned with the rising cost of housing, particularly for young folks. On this, we agree. But in his speech, he skipped right over institutional investors, pension funds, and real estate investment trusts that are treating the housing market like stocks, making huge profits on the backs of young people and other low-income folks that he says he wants to stand up for. So does he agree that homes should be places that people live and not commodities for folks to trade in? And is he not also concerned that there's nothing in this bill to address this, like removing preferential tax treatment for real estate investment trusts?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, it's no surprise that institutional investors have been able to outbid everyday working class Canadians for housing. Why? Because the government flooded the financial system with $400 billion of newly created cash. And when they pump that cash into the financial system, it goes into mortgage lending. And who is preferred to borrow that money? Well, the wealthy, well-connected institutional investors. They got their hands on that money, and they used it to bid up housing prices out of the reach of the working class, meaning that young people who not long ago would have been able to afford a home are now permanent renters. We need to change this system. We need to stop the money printing, ensure that we have a financial and monetary system based on hard, sound money. And finally, we need to incentivize local government gatekeepers to get out of the way, deliver faster and more affordable building permits so that we can get houses built for our youth.
Yes. Questions and comments? Young member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank the Leader of the official opposition for not only winning our Conservative leadership race recently, but also for laying out a clear vision on how we can actually fix all the problems created by this Liberal government. Now, it seems like we've seen this movie before, and I look back to when we had Pierre Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada, and we saw inflation go out of control because of out-of-control government spending, and interest rates go sky high. I bought my first chunk of farmland back in 1984, and I paid 21.5% interest rates on my mortgage. That's because of irresponsible government programs and increased money spending that happened throughout our economy. Now, is this a problem, again, of Liberal times are always tough times? And does that relate back, I'm going to ask the Leader of the Opposition, is this, again, father like son?
Yeah. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
You know, they're like the Bourbon dynasty over there. They learn nothing and they forget nothing. You know, they right back to the same policy. You know, Pierre Trudeau gave us, he ran monstrous money printing deficits, and of course that led to 12% inflation and 12% unemployment, and then ultimately 19 or 20% interest rates. You combine unemployment and inflation, you get the misery index. It reached a record-smashing 24 under the first Trudeau, and that delivered the highest suicide rates in Canadian history, 1983. Sad. And I remember my earliest memories are of that time, how my parents suffered. Because while they were school teachers and didn't lose their jobs, they got hit with those interest rate hikes just like everyone else and lost their rental properties, and we ended up having to move to a smaller place because of that. We were among the lucky that we were able to get into a home. But here we are following the same policies. Yeah. And now we have 40-year highs in inflation. Inflation is higher than at any time since the last Trudeau. We do the same things, you get the same results. The good news is that after Canada was liberated from Pierre Trudeau, we spent a lot of years doing the exact opposite, shrinking the size of government, reforming our tax